Hello, my name is Rachel,
And I'm Hope.
and today we are going to teach you how to make reading visible by utilizing a tool called an SRI in your classroom. So, an SRI stands for Symbolic Story Representation or Symbolic Representation Interview, depending on how you approach it. And basically, it's a technique that is a kind of reading manipulation that allows students to demonstrate in a presentation what they are reading and how they are reading it through the use of objects and cutouts.
So basically, an SRI is a technique that is used to assist readers by providing them with an outlet for explaining what a specific text is about and how they read it.
Exactly. So the first one, well, what we've decided to go with is a book called Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Essentially, that book is about a near future dystopian society in which firemen do not put out fires, they actually begin them, and what they burn is books. And the main character, Guy Montag, it's basically a story about his progression as a character and how he goes from loving the burn to seeing life in books. So that's essentially what the story is about.
And just to let you guys know, there are technically 10 steps to an SRI, but for time's sake and for the demonstration's sake, we're just going to do steps 1 through 4, and then also 6, because 6 sort of correlates as well with 4. There are 10 steps, like I said, but the other ones are like sort of additional add-ons or just the part of acting it out.
Mm-hmm. So the first step is selecting a scene. So you can go ahead and explain what that means.
So to select a scene, you're sort of looking for an important scene that is in the text. It should be dramatized. It should be a scene to which they had a very strong response to, because that will help with their third step, and then also their sixth step. And then within selecting the scene, you're also going to be selecting the characters. In a traditional or more actual classroom, you're going to have them create the scene. So like do a little diorama-esque thing. And then you're going to have them create the characters, and you're going to have them create like certain symbols or props within that.
Mm-hmm. So the scene I chose it happened a little bit later in the book. It was when Montag, the main character, his fire station receives an alert that there is a neighbor that is possibly hoarding books. So him and his team go and they find the books and they burn the books, and consequently they burn the house down as well. And the woman, she refuses to leave the house, and she actually dies with her books. In fact, she's the one that lights the match after they soak everything with kerosene. So that's the scene that I chose.
The scene that I chose is towards the beginning. It's when Guy Montag, the main character, meets a very important character. Her name is Clarice McLaren. He's on his way home from a night shift with being a fireman. He still smells like kerosene. He makes a very distinction about that. And he meets this girl who looks younger. She's very beautiful, but she has this sort of curiosity to her that just sort of makes him start to wonder and think about things. The scene is very important because it starts Guy's slow descent from being content with the society to realizing that there's something wrong and there's something going on that he needs to address.
Yeah. So the second step is considering how you read, and this is the part where you would think about yourself as a reader, that the students would think about themselves as readers, and how their feelings and emotions about the scene progress throughout it. So what I chose was this little cutout that I made. It's an eyeball, and this was made with construction paper, glue, and it's stuck on the back of a library pencil. So if it can really be made with anything, this is where students can kind of get creative. This is like a little puppet. This is something that the text actually suggests because it's very easy to use these to act out the scene. And the reason I chose an eyeball was because I really felt like I could see through the lens of all the characters, even the ones who committed actions that I don't condone. In the scene, I really felt like I could look through the eyes of Montag, the woman, and even the books. Later on, I'll talk about how I personified those books with my own emotions and feelings, and I really felt like I was looking at the room through the eyes of those books. So this is kind of myself as a reader, and that is why I chose to represent myself this way.
I did mine a little bit different. I didn't do it as a puppet, just to show you guys that there is a multitude of ways that you can do this. You can have your students do it in case you don't have these sort of supplies within your classroom where you have popsicle sticks or an abundance of pencils and tape. So I did mine on an index card. The symbol that I chose for myself is a pair of glasses. I chose a pair of glasses because every time I approach a book, specifically this book, I'm looking at things new through a new perspective. So I'm seeing something different. So like with the firemen in Fahrenheit 451, they're not like our firemen. So I'm looking at something through a new perspective and a new lens. And this sort of helps me to look at things more clearer.
Okay.
So then,
go ahead.
So then the next step is going to be step 3, which is writing down the moves. This is the very important step that you need to get your students to use, because this is where the thinking and creating your thinking visually comes into play. So with thinking about your moves, you want to have your students list about 5 moves, and that's going to be things that they either did while they were reading, they felt while they were reading, they noticed, they connected with, they thought about, they questioned, they saw. It's an abundance of things, but it's just moves or things that made them think while they were reading. And this is to get, sorry, this is to get your students to start considering themselves as readers and consider what goes on while they're reading. So this is the thinking, and then through this, then you'll be able to make it visible for them as to what their thinking process looks like. So for my moves in my scene, let me get my index cards. You start off with Guy. So this is like one of the opening scenes. It's not the very first scene, but it's one of the opening scenes. So you start off with Guy, and he's just coming back from doing fireman duty. So he just burnt a house or burnt some books down. And so to me, what I noticed was the complete distinction between what a fireman was to them. So to them, it was the the aspect of the burning, so not the putting the fire out, but starting the fire. So I sort of thought of him as the flame, because he also notes that he smells of kerosene like it's perfume. So that was something that was interesting to me, because he's looking at it as like a good thing. He smells of it, so he is sort of content with his role within society, is what I saw that as. So I'm like with him right now, I'm reading, and I'm like, okay, he's content with society. And then comes in Clarice. And Clarice is this character that she changes, and my perspective of her changes throughout it, but I'm just going to look at what my perspective of her was at this moment. So Clarice comes in, and she sort of makes him question what's going on, because she's this very bubbly, very talkative girl. She even calls herself 17 and crazy. So she says that your age plus your you have to say your age and then crazy is what her uncle told her to do. So that was something that I thought was interesting and weird, is that they think adolescents are crazy just because of their age. So the fact that they're younger is the fact that makes them crazy. And she's very curious. He notes that too. He says that she is one second, I gotta find it. It's there. Is that she's a kind of gentle hunger that touched over everything with tireless curiosity. So he thinks of her as something that's very curious. So now I'm sort of with Clarice, because I'm sort of thinking like, what's going on I'm very curious too. I'm wondering what's going on within this novel because it's at the very beginning, and I'm wondering what's up with this guy. Like, why is he burning things instead of putting them out? So that was what my moves were when I was reading my scene.
Okay, well put. So again, this is me as a reader, and some of the things I noticed, can't remember if I've already mentioned this, but the woman did not have a name. She was not given any kind of description at all. She was just a woman kind of used to further Ray Bradbury's plot. So that was something that I did notice. And then also, something else I noticed was that Montag, at one point, he's going through the house, he's trying to find the books, and a book falls into his hands, and the first line that he accidentally reads as, "Time has fallen asleep in the afternoon sunshine," which is actually a reference to a group who memorize books to kind of form a human living library, and that is a big piece of foreshadowing for the end of the novel. For those of you who've read it, you know. Um, so that was something that I noticed. And throughout the scene, my feelings as a reader definitely changed. So I have this fire, and it's blue because it's kind of my disappointment as a reader. The first time I read this scene, I thought that Montag was going to do something to save the books and or the woman. At this point, he had met Clarice. He was just starting to kind of see the error of society's ways and his own ways. So I really thought this was going to be like a little bit of a breakthrough for him and kind of show his development as a character. And so I was let down, and my emotions as a reader were engulfed in flames as the scene in the book was. And so there was that, as well as this. This is what I use to represent the woman in the scene. So I think it's important to note here the difference between a symbol and a prop because they can be easily confused. So like this is a book and maybe like, well, that's a prop. Well, actually it is a symbol because it's used to represent a character. It's not a book used to represent a book. So props are much more literal while symbols are a bit more figurative. So that's kind of the difference that the text talks about. And I know students get that confused a lot and it's very easy to get mixed up. So I have this, and then as a reader, over time, I become much more identified with, oh goodness, with the woman herself. Let's see, with the woman herself. And so we kind of become one. So I move closer to her. So this is me as a reader. I move closer to her. And then I'm feeling the exact same pain that she's feeling in a way. I love to read. I love books. I don't know if I would stay in a burning house with them, but I definitely understand what it's like to love something so passionately and so dearly that you would do this kind of radical thing. This may be a little bit extreme, but do something along these lines to fight for what you are passionate about, what you believe in. And in this case, she was against government censorship, and she loved her books, and she wasn't just going to leave just because they told her to. She knew this was the end of the line, and in a way, she thought this was the only way to go. And it also has to do with the quote that she gives the firemen when they bust down her door. So what she says to them is, "Play the man, Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." So, and that's actually a historical reference to a man named Vladimir and another man named Nicholas Ridley. So I'll get more into that in a second when I start talking about the author, but it's definitely very significant. Out of all the quotes Ray Bradbury could have chosen for her to say, she says that. So that's another reason why I kind of move closer to her, and why I kind of identify with her in the burning definitely plays into what she says and kind of makes her a martyr for what she believes in. So that's basically why she was used. And so that was what I noticed in my scene a little bit, my making the moves, writing down the moves. So yeah, the next part is considering the author. So this is where you would pause and take a moment to kind of think about how you would represent the author. So I chose a little chess piece called the bishop. For those of you who do not know, a bishop can only move diagonally in chess. And that is part of the reason why I chose to represent Ray Bradbury as the bishop. because I do not feel like he pulled his audience in any linear fashion. It was definitely between, it was definitely an endless motion between time and ideas. And so back to the quote I used earlier that she says by Latimer and Nicholas Ridley were persecuted, especially talks about Nicholas Ridley. He was burned for not agreeing with Bloody Mary's ascension to the throne. So he wanted someone else to be queen, and he died a martyr for his cause, just like this woman did. And again, out of all the things he could have chosen, out of all the things he could have chosen that more directly correlated with the theme in the novel that he's presenting right here, he chose that. So that was kind of why I chose this. And he's moving us between, I mean, that happened October 16th, 1555. So he's definitely moving us back in time and then forward and then from one perspective to the next and then to a different idea. So that's why during this scene, I became a bit closer with the author because I really thought it was a scene that perpetuated his the message he's trying to convey to his audience about this censorship in the government and the satirical morals he's trying to pursue here. So that is why I chose a bishop for Ray Bradbury.
And for my author, I chose a caution sign. So this novel was written in the 1950s, and during this time was the McCarthyism era, which was essentially they were taking people who they thought were communists, they were locking them up, and they were either executing them or they were keeping them in jail. I don't know if you've heard of the Hollywood 10. There were 10 Hollywood stars during this time that were executed and were put into jail just because they were seen as communists. So during this time, they also were taking communist books or books that were related to themes or symbols or anything related to communism, and they were burning the books. So when I was reading this, I sort of thought of Bradbury as being a person who was telling us caution. We have, like, during this time, he's doing this, and he can see something going on wrong with the society. We're breaking a lot of our rules. The McCarthyist era was breaking the First Amendment. They weren't giving them their rights. So he's seeing that something's going to go wrong, and we need to look at ourselves differently, and we need to be cautious in the way that we handle threats to our society, because the society may not be what is threatening us ourselves. He's looking at this through sort of more of a Big Brother aspect, if you think of it that way, very dystopian. The government has all the control, and you can see through Guy Montag that he is being more cautious of the society as he goes on, because he's very content with it. And then as he gets further into the story, he's getting more cautious. So I see Bradbury telling us to be cautious, watch what we're doing, and stop.
Yes, very well put. So both of us can talk about the last step, or not really the last step, but for us, the last step, number 6, consider the author's message. And I think we both kind of touched on it a bit with our consider the author portion of the SRI, but definitely there's some clarification we could give with consider the author's message, because it correlates with the author and considering the author, but there's still some details that we need to go over there. So considering the author's message. So basically, you kind of better understand your scene here. You better understand why it was utilized, how it was set up, why it was set up this way, what exactly the author was trying to relay to the audience. And not just in this scene, but how it ties into the book and its theme as a whole. And so what are the overall themes and ideas trying to be pushed here? So.
And there's a set of questions within the text that you're asking your students to use to sort of assist them in understanding the scene more clearly. The first one is, what do you notice within the text that leads you to believe you should pay attention to them? And how can you represent this textual coding in your SRI? So you're asking them to not only create a symbol for their author, but also some of the ideas and symbols within the text itself. So you're trying to find more ways to create those puppets and make it more visual for them as to what is going on within that scene. The second one is, why do you think the author drew your attention to these ideas? You're getting them to start to think not only for themselves as a reader, but for the author. What do you think is her or his own take on generalization about these issues? What does the text make you think so? How will you show how you noticed and interpreted these authorial moves with moves of your own? So you're just starting to get them to make connections with the author, what's going on in the text, and to make that more visual for them so that they can see visually what's going on within that scene, like I said. And then the last thing is you're just having them explain how they agree, how they would adapt, or how they resist with the author's generalization about these issues or about the themes. How will you show this response through your reader cutout and other cutouts or objects? So now you're starting to get into the how. You're starting to get them to think not only about themselves as as readers and with that author, but you're starting to get them to make their own connections, and you're getting them to start to think more into the text. You're getting them to think outside of just the evidence. But do you agree? Do you disagree? You're starting to get them to think more into the mentality of the book.
Yep, exactly. So for this particular book, what I chose was to consider the author's message outside of this scene. Like, this is the specific scene that I chose because I thought it was very significant, and I still think that, but also to look at how it ties into the other aspects of the book. So for this, I put that Bradbury was a sci-fi author in the 1950s, where you have McCarthyism going on and things like that, and he definitely showed his views on that here. So there's some questions that the author wants us to ask ourselves as we're reading, like, has technology disconnected us from one another? And just how far will government censorship go? So those are the things the author wants us to consider as we read. So I think that the author's message is more to make us question rather than to give us definite answers. So that is my interpretation from the text based on the scene I selected.
And so then with my interpretation, I sort of made two characters as well, but these are sort of more symbols than they are the characters themselves. So I'm sort of looking at the robotic aspect of Mildred, which is Guy Montag's mother, and then I'm looking at Clarice, which is, she sort of started off as a question mark to me, and then she went into this picture of a plant, which I consider is like life. Um, so for me, when I was reading this, the message that I was sort of getting was that in a society where we're limited our words and we're limited with this technology, we sort of become robots because we're not allowed to think for ourselves and we're not allowed to make our own decisions anymore. We're doing it for the not the greater good, but we're doing it for the society. We're doing it for the government, not for ourselves. So I see that the society is sort of turning into robots. And this sort of makes me think about how with more government control comes more, or not more, but less freedom, less rights, less thinking, less doing things for yourself, less individuality. So within Bradbury, he's sort of cautioning us to think about the McCarthyism era because they're burning these books and they're not allowing these people to have their rights to think outside of what the government wants. So he's sort of looking and cautioning us about our government, not just the government of communism, because communists, I mean, they believe in more government control, but he's saying that they should have that right to believe in that. Because if you take people's books away, you take their ability to start thinking for themselves away, then what do they really have but empty vessels for society views? They're robots for society.
Exactly. So yeah, that was a good explanation of it, and I think it was a pretty good and common interpretation of the text, and definitely looking at it in the historical light and the period in which Ray Bradbury wrote it, it definitely makes a lot of sense. So basically, in SRI, creating reading that is visible is very important because essays do not work for every student. And so by allowing them to act out these things, they can visibly see themselves progressing as a reader, which and eventually helps them to understand the text as a whole because they really have to break it down and dissect it. They really have to know the details and what they think is significant. And it definitely helps students who just don't connect well with essays. It definitely helps them to still express their ideas because just because they can't write an essay well or they don't think they can write an essay well doesn't mean that they didn't understand the text or that they don't have ideas that they want to vocalize. So this is definitely a good alternative for students such as that.
Yes, also with an SRI, it's very into getting metacognition going on. So you're getting your students to think about their thinking. So when you have them do the how aspect of the SRI, so how do you read that text, you're getting them to think about their own thinking, which is a really good thing. We've talked about this before in other demonstration videos and lessons. Talked about the Vygotsky theory of metacognition, and he believed that learners need to be able to talk their way through what they were learning in order to fully process it. So when you're getting these students to look at, to visualize what they're doing, it's very helpful for them to engage in metacognition. And it can also help those students who don't even realize that they can do it. They may think, I don't even know what I'm reading. I don't know how I'm reading this. This can help them to get into thinking about that thinking.
Yep, exactly. So that's basically the most significant steps summarized. An SRI, again, usually about 8 to 10 minutes, but we kind of shortened ours and combined ours a little bit to lessen that amount of time so we could explain it a bit more, a bit better. So thank you guys. I hope that this was informative and beneficial for you. So that's it.